Welcome back, folks, and welcome to the making of my Gosforth Handyman sign. This has been a project I've been wanting to do for a couple of years, to be honest, and then when Maker Central came about, it was a good opportunity to kind of pull my finger out and get this project finally done to have a sign for in my workshop. So obviously I've got a vague idea of what size I want the sign to be, so I've printed it out kind of poster size, and then I need to join all the bits of the poster together. And then obviously the letters, which I'm going to be cutting out separately, I have to make sure that I've cut those out to the same scale as the rest of the poster. And then it's just a question of measuring it all up in the workshop, ready to cut out all of the circular elements first, and just to make note of some of the measurements. Always handy to have the sign on display as reference for when you're working. Just using my little Bosch handheld router to cut all the circles out with a little circle jig. I do this in 2 passes because it's a bit too thick to do all in one go, so I do one pass about halfway through and then another pass just to get all the way through the other side of the 12mm MDF board. Really dusty job this. You can see I've got the dust mask on for this. I'm now cutting the outer ring segment. This is probably one of the trickiest circular cuts to do, and then the inner ring segment as well. And then just some spray glue to hold the letters onto some scrap bits of MDF, ready to cut them all out. So working out where the tick needs to go was a little bit tricky. So you can see all I've done here, I'm putting some markings onto my original printout, and then I'm carrying a line right across to the edge of the white circle, and then I can use that as a reference point on the board to then put the same markings onto the MDF board, and then I can align the tick to the lines that I've now drawn onto the MDF, so it should be in exactly the same place. So I'm now cutting out the inside of the tick here. Don't copy anything that I'm doing on the bandsaw here. You are going to notice my fingers are fairly close to the blade, but I've done this many times. Also, obviously this footage is sped up and I'm working very slowly and very carefully on all of the cuts that I'm doing here. You'll see where I cut into this circle to start the tick off in the first place. It's not the sort of cut with a sign like this that I can just super glue it back together, so I just ended up using some 2-part filler to fill that. I haven't bothered filming me filling the little gap. It's not very exciting, but it's just from the initial cut into the tick to get the actual blade into that section. And then the same on the letters here. The letters are too small to just cut into the letter and then glue the 2 sections of the letter together, if that makes sense. The curve of the blade would remove too much material, it would end up being noticeable. So the only option here really is to drill into each internal cutout, and then using the coping saw I can cut out all the inners of the letters first. And you'll notice I'm doing all of that before I've cut the letters out of the main sheet of wood, because I want to have as much material as possible to put into the vise so that I can clamp it up while I'm doing these cuts. The hardest bits of these cuts is getting really into the sharp corner points of each letter, and because of the curve of the actual coping saw blade, there's no way I could get all the way to the top of the letter A, for example, so I'll sort that shortly. You'll see how I sort that out. And then once all the internal cuts are done, I'm onto the bandsaw to do all of the main letter cuts. Now, a little tip here, with all of the outside cuts, I don't need to be that accurate at the minute. The inside cuts, for example, getting into the little bits of this letter N, do have to be completely accurate at this stage, but the outside of the letter N doesn't need to be accurate at all. Just needs to be close enough. If you like these sort of projects, it would be awesome to have you on board as a subscriber. Just hit the subscribe button and click the little bell notification icon so that you get notified when I release new videos. And if you have enjoyed this video, it would make my day if you could give it a little like as well. Again, you'll see my fingers look like they're pretty close to the blade, but because I take responsibility for my own safety, I'm not doing anything that's outside of my comfort zone. You'll see there's always a piece of material between me and the blade, and if there isn't, then I use something such as a pencil here to hold the piece while I'm cutting it. Do not copy what I'm doing here. If you're not comfortable working with a bandsaw like this, then don't do it. And now you can see on my bench grinder, I can now just work at taking all of the outer portions of the letters away, and this is a much easier way of doing it than trying to get dead on accurate with a bandsaw, and you get a really nice finish as well. And you'll see I'm using zero clearance, just a piece of wood against it, just so there's no chance of the letter getting caught between the sanding disc and the support. So here, I'm just tidying all the letters up, giving them a bit of a sand. I've got all my files out. You can see I'm using a Stanley knife to get into all the little sharp points of each letter. And then we're on to the painting. So priming everything first, just bog standard acrylic water-based white primer. And then once that's all dry, quick sand down, denib it, and then we're ready for the top coats of paint. I hated this paint. It was the only paint that I could find in a tester pot that was about the right colour, but it was awful stuff to work with. It's supposed to be matte, but you'll see it doesn't have a matte finish at all, and there's not really enough paint in the pot to use with a normal roller. I can use a normal roller just to lay it off, but if I'd used a normal roller to try and do all of the painting from square one, there's so little paint in these little pots, it wouldn't really have worked out. But I was in a rush and I needed to crack on and get this finished, and the only place that was open was Wickes, and the only red paint they had was this awful Dulux stuff. I'll not be buying it again. You'll see the final finish. It's supposed to be matte. It's not a matte finish. It's kind of a weird, almost like a slightly sparkly sheen to it. It's just a bizarre finish. And you'll see later on my frog tape wouldn't stick to it or anything. It was just an absolute pain in the backside. I had to put about 4 coats of paint on just to get it looking vaguely even. In all honesty, for projects like this in the past, Wickes' own brand paint has been absolutely fine, but they didn't have any in red. But you can see it's got like an almost slightly sparkly sheen to it. It's difficult to describe without seeing it in real life. Just attaching the outer ring now with CA glue. I've got the clamps in place. The clamps are my reference point. As long as the ring is touching the clamps, I know it's in the right place. And then I'm just using my calipers to work out the position of the inner ring. And as I say, my plan was to use frog tape as a temporary marker, but look, the frog tape won't stick to this paint. I mean, this paint is completely dry, by the way. This is, obviously, we've fast forwarded a day here, and the paint's totally dry, and the frog tape just won't stick to it. I've never seen a matte paint like this in my life. I'm just using sticks-like glue for this particular piece because it's quite a big piece and it's a bit too much for CA glue. And the advantage of using the sticks-like glue is that I've got slightly longer working time. I can kind of move it around a little bit. I can get my calipers back out and check that it's all in the right place. If I used CA glue and stuck it in place and then I couldn't move it again, I would have a problem. So for that big piece, keeping clear of CA glue is the best option. And then for everything else, all the smaller pieces, it's just CA glue. The final tricky bit is working out where all the letters go in relation to the tick. So what I'm going to do, I'm using a ruler to basically draw tiny little reference points on the outer ring which are perfectly in line with every single letter, and then I'm going to use those reference points later on when I come to glue each letter in place. Just attaching a string with a piece of blue tack. This is exactly in the center of the circle, and you'll see why I'm doing that in a minute. So I've now got little reference marks all the way around the outer white ring. It's kind of difficult to see the reference marks, you'll see them in a minute, but I'm looking at those reference marks to make sure the letters are close to being in the correct position, and then I'm using the string to make sure that every piece is perfectly aligned, because everything needs to be centrally aligned, pointing towards the center of the circle, if that makes sense. Then again, attaching each letter with CA glue. The way that I do this, by the way, if you're ever working on projects, lettering projects like this, don't start at one letter and then do the next letter and do the next one, because if you make a mistake, every single error will kind of amplify itself as you work your way around. What I like to do is get a starting point and an ending point, so you can see I've done the G and I'm now doing the H. And now I'm skipping two letters, I'm doing the O, and then I'll skip another letter and do the S, and then I'll fill in between. So I'm now doing the O between the G and the S, I'll then do the F between the S and the O, and then I'll finally do the R and the T. And it just means if you do make a mistake, relatively speaking, it's not really noticeable. But if you went and did them all in order, and you made a tiny little error in the positioning, by the time you get to your last letter, you'll be wildly out. Same on the bottom row of letters as well. If you look on the outer ring, you'll see the tiny little markings that I've put on there so that I can work out the relative positioning. I'm just working out the position between the outer ring and the inner ring. I'm just doing that by eye. That's an easy enough one to work out, but getting it perfectly in line to the center of the circle and in the correct place in relation to the outer ring is critical for this sign to look right. If I didn't do that, it would look completely wrong. That's it, all done and dusted. Final part is just to put a hook on the back. So in order to do that, I need to work out the exact top and bottom of the circle, and then I'll transfer that mark over onto the back of the sign. I'm just being very careful not to accidentally drill all the way through the sign, just for a little keyhole bracket. It's not particularly heavy, this is more than enough to hold it up. A few little bumper pads, and that's it, all done and dusted. I hope you enjoyed this. Don't forget to subscribe if you're new to the channel. I shall see you next time.